to our keynote speech. 3 years ago, Robert Putnam, the author of Our Kids, joined us at Hildene in Manchester to talk about the opportunity gap. Last winter, Vermont Women's Fund brought Jodi Kantor, the New York Times reporter behind the Harvey Weinstein story, to a packed house in Burlington. Part of the role of philanthropy is to bring ideas and speakers that challenge us, inspire us, and make us think. In that spirit, it's my pleasure to welcome Richard Reeves. I'm going to revert to his bio in the program so we can take 2 minutes out, reclaim it, and give it to him for speaking. But I would call out that he is one of Politico Magazine's 2017 top 50 thinkers in the US. His research focuses on the middle class, equity, in America. So I'm excited to bring Richard to the stage to share his thoughts on what's going on in the world.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for bringing me here, and thank you especially to Paige Pearson, who has done so much of the work. Can you actually give a round of applause to Paige? Paige has been providing the water, which is really important. Obviously, I didn't know Dave. It's my first time in Vermont, but I feel like I do, feel like I did, and I had tears rolling down my eyes during that video, so well done to whoever put that together, and thank you for allowing me to share that. And thanks to Dan for mentioning the Politico Top 50 award. He's quite right, I was named one of the top thinkers in the US last year. I must say, in previous years, that list has always struck me as completely stupid. Totally arbitrary, subjective, clickbait nonsense. But this year, it's a very solid assessment. So I'm going to accelerate my remarks a little bit because I'm now the only real remaining thing between you and whatever's happening behind me. Does it involve any of that craft beer or craft gin, by the way? I don't know, but either way, it sounds great. I'm going to start with 2 confessions. The first is that, as you may have realized by now, I'm not from Vermont. I'm not originally from the US, and part of the challenge of my role is to talk to American audiences about class and inequality with this accent. So here's my defense. My defense is as follows. Number 1, as you can tell, I'm from the UK. No doubt you've guessed that by now. We know a lot about class, where I come from. I know what a class-conscious society looks like. And I've come to believe, in fact, that my new home is every much a class-stratified society as the one I left behind. In terms of class division, I feel like I've left the frying pan and jumped into the fire. The difference is that in the US, the class divisions, alongside the racial divisions and other divisions, are clouded, they're disguised by the myth of classlessness, the idea that America is a meritocracy. That turns out to be a very convenient idea indeed to those who are succeeding in that society. So camouflaged by this idea of classlessness, the US is actually propagating a ruthlessly effective class reproduction machine. The opportunity gap is a class gap as well as a race gap and a gender gap. And the opportunity gap is also to be found in communities, in cities, in counties. And that is also where it must be solved. And that's why the work of community foundations and others who are working at that, I'm being attacked, is so important. I was going to say this may be the most rural environment that I've spoken in, but I actually spoke in Wyoming once, and a grizzly bear went past the window as I was speaking. And I lost my audience completely. So that's number 1 confession. The second part of my defense, though, is that I am now a US citizen. On October the 20th, 2016, on the very last day you could register to vote in the 2016 presidential election, I took the oath of allegiance in my home state of Maryland, along with 52 other people from 47 other nations. And it's one of the most important and moving experiences of my life. But I can tell you that it was a more important and more moving experience for the one from Afghanistan on my right and the family from Vietnam on my left. And I still think that that idea, the sacred idea of a society that's not a society of hereditary status, where you don't know your place, but you take your place and make your place, is a profoundly inspiring one despite the failure of us to live up to it so far. My second confession is that I have some charts, but I'm a Brookings Senior Fellow, and we don't go anywhere without charts. This feels like almost the worst environment for charts, but Dan had charts. I answer the question, how was your day, dear, with charts? I said, do you want the mean or the median? It depends, you know. And at least one person here knows what I'm talking about. I met Amy Makanovich earlier, and she started her career as a Brookings researcher, so she knows what's coming. Lots of charts, but I will keep the charts, I promise, very, very short. So what I'm going to do is try and articulate at the beginning of the talk, and then I'll skip little bits, the central message of my talk, which I now realize is related to some of the messages you've heard today about the importance of giving. Clearly, giving is hugely important, but I've also come to believe that if we're really serious about closing the opportunity gap, it also requires some giving up of some of the privileges that those of us who are on the right side of the meritocracy have, giving up some of the power that we have over certain institutions. So giving, yes, but giving up too. And that's a much tougher thing, I think, for many of us to contemplate, but I've come to believe that it's absolutely necessary. So I'm going to start with a quick story. And this will be there'll be more story than charts. So I have to point it this way, I think. So there's some young people in the audience, just in case. This is President Barack Obama, the 44th President of the United States. And doesn't it feel like a long time ago? You know, I'm not a partisan in the US, but I will say the following. I've observed that there are human years, dog years, and Trump years. It feels like an eon, regardless of what you think about the administration. It's like, isn't it a long time ago? As I said, I am not partisan. As a member of the Brookings Institutions, I'm required not to be, and I'm genuinely not. There are things that the administration has done which I have publicly supported. There are things that the administration has done which I have not. And in fact, I'm about to criticize this man a little bit. But it illustrates my story quite well. This is 2015, and Barack Obama has published his tax bill. Something happens to this tax bill, which is the moment I decided to address this subject. So he's flying on Air Force One. He's flying from India to Saudi Arabia. And he's just published his tax bill like the week before. And he gets, Nancy Pelosi gets a call. Obviously you know who Nancy Pelosi is. She gets a call from this man, Chris Van Hollen. Chris Van Hollen was my congressman at the time. He's now the junior senator for my state of Maryland. There he is. Chris says to Nancy, I have a problem with this tax bill. And she says, I do too. You have to kill this idea. There's a specific idea in the tax bill that both Chris Van Hollen and Nancy Pelosi say you have to kill. She said, well, as it happens, Chris, I'm on Air Force One with the president, which she was. So she goes along to the office in Air Force One, and here is the president. This is, as they say in Hollywood, based on real events. So he's in his office, and comes a knock at the door. Come in. Who is it? It's Nancy. Hi, Nancy. What's up? And she says, it's this idea in your tax bill. We have to kill it. Chris was just on the phone to me. We have to kill this idea. I think we have to kill it too. And he says, OK, I'll think about it. So he goes to consult with senior advisors, goes back to his office, and he calls the White House and says, hello, White House, it's the president. Kill the idea. I don't know how it works in practice, but something like that. And the very next day, his spokesman went in front of the press and killed the idea, saying it had been a distraction. The idea was to reform something called 529 college savings accounts. Hands up who knows what a 529 college savings account is. Yeah. It's a good test, actually. Different audiences say different, you get different answers with different audiences, of course. 529 college savings accounts are, as you know, tax-advantaged tax savings accounts. They're free of capital gains tax, they're mostly free of gift taxes, and in many states also free of income tax up to a certain level. So where I live in Maryland, my wife and I can save $10,000 a year for our 2 kids' 529 accounts, set that against our Maryland income tax, that saves us $675 a year for doing something we were going to do anyway to give us money that we don't need. As you would expect, when this was originally suggested in the 90s, Bill Clinton vetoed it out of sight as one of the most regressive tax ideas he'd ever seen. But when he was out of office, it was then passed. These 529 accounts have since become quite an important part of the architecture of higher education funding. And in the recent tax bill, they were extended so that 529 funds can now be used for private K-12 schools as well as for college. That was a significant expansion in its use, which, by the way, will cost some states billions of dollars because there'll be a rush to 529 accounts for anybody who has their kids in a private school. So why were they going to reform this? Well, this is the reason why they're going to reform it. This chart shows you, I promise there won't be too many more charts like this, poorest quartile on the left. So these are households ranked by how poor they are. So split the population up into equally sized quarters. And this tells you, the dark blue tells you what percentage of people in that income quartile have a 529 account. This is all families. And then the right-hand one tells you, of those who have one, what's the average balance in that 529 account. As Bill Clinton predicted, it actually did become the most regressive element of the tax code, I think even with the exception of mortgage interest deduction. And so President Obama proposed to reform this and replace it with a tax credit. All hell broke loose. And all hell broke loose not just on the right, but on the left. It broke loose in the upper middle class. It broke loose among people like us. It broke loose among people who are, by any sensible measure, very affluent, but who'd convinced themselves, because of the rising cost of private colleges, that they were entitled to this tax break. So there is an entitlement culture, but I fear it might be a bit stronger at the top than it is at the bottom. This is a chart showing you the value of tax deductions, upside-down tax subsidies for the bottom 40% of the distribution, the middle 40% of the distribution, the top 20% of the distribution. So that's half as many people. But as you can see, we, and I do mean we in my case because I am in this group, get significantly more of the value of those tax deductions, mortgage interest deduction being the biggest example, but it's true for healthcare, pensions, and 529s are in there, somewhere at about $2 billion a year. Now, the point is not to give you a lecture on financing of higher education, although I would be happy to do that. It's the kind of thing that we love doing. Simply to point out that it was killed by 2 relatively liberal Democrats, and these are the median incomes of the areas that they represent by comparison to the national. These are affluent constituents, including me and my neighbors, who filled up the inboxes of Pelosi and Van Hollen, killed the idea stone dead. So 529s are here to stay. We might as well reform them now that they're here, by the way. And this is why, Paul Waldman put it very well in the Post, the proposal was targeted at what may be the single most dangerous constituency to anger, the upper middle class. Wealthy enough to have influence, numerous enough to be a significant voting bloc. Maybe including many of you, certainly including me, almost all my colleagues, all my neighbors, most of my friends, are in this group, the upper middle class. And until we're willing to give up as well as to give, we're in trouble. So I wrote this book called Dream Hoarders, now in paperback, also in audio version, downloadable now. I actually read it myself, but I had to audition for the part. Can you imagine the existential crisis that would have been caused if I'd failed the audition to read my own book? Anyway, so all good booksellers, bad booksellers, everywhere. And it was actually that moment that made me think, there was this sort of sense that I think what's happening in the US is that the upper middle class, broadly the top 20% of the distribution, however we want to define it, but are to some extent not only doing well, not only enjoying much greater opportunities, but to some extent hoarding them, to some extent rigging certain institutions and markets in our favor. And therefore we are somewhat complicit in the inequality that we see at a structural level. Now, who's heard of the phrase, we are the 99%, or Occupy Wall Street, or the top 1%, etc.? Yeah, from Vermont, of course. Made pretty famous, I think, by some locally very well-known politicians, amongst others. And so there's this kind of sense of like the top 1% are pulling away from everybody else. This is the kind of chart that shows you that. This shows you the real income growth, average income growth for different income groups. Top 1%, the 19% below them, the 40% below them, and the 40% below them. So what you can see from here is, look at these people running away. Now, to be in the top 1% of the distribution now, you need a household income of well north of $400,000. $450 probably now. To be in the 19% below them, to make it into that top 20%, you need a household income now of about $140,000. Now, I'm in this group down here. I'm in the top quintile, but not the top percentile. And if you look at a chart like this, you can see that we're all just bumping along the bottom together. It is the top 1%. Look at me, just an ordinary member of the hard-working middle class here, bumping along with everybody else. But as many of you will know, social scientists do their dirty work in two places. One in their footnotes and two in their left-hand axes. Always look at the left-hand axis, and I've had to take it up to 2 million because they're so bloody rich, these people. Most frustrating of all, some of them you went to college with. And they maybe didn't even do as well at US college. That's where the real class warfare is to be found. From the people that are just doing pretty darn well and the people that are doing absurdly well. And the anger of the former for the latter is where it gets really... In fact, if you look at the Occupy Wall Street March in May, a third of the people there had individual earnings of more than $100,000. That puts them in the top 10% of the earnings distribution, but they're marching against inequality. So let's change the left-hand axis. This now takes out the top 1% altogether. This shows you the income trends for the bottom 40% of the US distribution, the next 40% of the distribution, and then the top 19% above them without the top 1%. So my left-hand axis shrinks. Right? It's a different kind of story. Now, I grant you it's not as exciting a chart. I can't make it as exciting because there's a lot more people in the 19% than there are in the 1%. There are, in fact, 19 times as many people. I'm not an economist by background, but I do know that. So it's not that, but this is a big inequality. There's a hell of a lot of people in that line. And they have power, different kind of power to the top 1%. We have power over our school boards. We have power over our housing boards. We have power over the institutions that we run or that we're part of. We have power in our neighborhoods. We have philanthropic, political, economic, and social power. And how we use that power, and whether we use it to serve ourselves or to serve others, turns out to be the most important question facing us. I'm going to skip through some of these charts, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to tell you what they say, and you're going to have to trust me, because I'm going to go so fast you won't be able to tell while I'm making this up. There's also a big wage gap. A lot of people get stuck at the bottom, but it turns out people get stuck at the top too. If you're born to rich parents, you've got a good chance of staying rich. There's stickiness at the top as well as at the bottom of the distribution, but we don't like to talk about that, because typically then it means talking about ourselves. Stickiness of wealth. If you're born to a parent in the top 20% of the distribution, you have a 40% chance of being in the top 20% of the wealth distribution yourself. Wealth is strongly inherited in the US, and more so in the US than in other countries. It's not true that the US is more mobile than other countries. It's not true. Only 50% of people born in 1980 are better off than their parents were at the same age, compared to 90% of people born in 1940. This is a measure of absolute mobility, and it tells you a lot about our current political and economic situation. There's huge gaps by education, massive gaps in income for those by education. Education has become such an important currency. Here's the good news about education. The grey chart, the grey line on this chart shows you the relationship between your parents' income and your income as an adult for the whole country. That's what the grey line shows, right? So it shows you that there's a very strong correlation. So the richer your parents were when you were growing up, the richer you're likely to be as an adult, the inheritance of inequality. But the other lines at the top tell me the relationship between the parents' income and the kids' income conditional on having attended an elite college at the top or a four-year college just below that at the bottom. The fact the lines are high tells you that people who get four-year college degrees or elite college degrees do well. Hardly a surprise. The fact the line is almost flat tells you that for poor kids who go to four-year colleges or good colleges, their outcomes are very similar to anybody else that goes to those colleges. It's an incredible leveler. It almost wipes away the effect of background. The role of post-secondary education in closing or propagating the opportunity gap is huge, and that's what I'm going to focus on in my last couple of minutes. So that was the good news. Here's the bad news. This is data from the Equality of Opportunity project run by Raj Chetty, now back at Harvard, who I work with part-time. And this shows you the relationship between the income of your parents, along the bottom, the horizontal axis, and the percentage chances of attending college between the ages of 18 and 21. Now, I don't know how many of you did statistics or kind of social science, but you know how sometimes people put up or scatter plots and so on, and they put a line through it and say there's a relationship, and you're sort of squinting at it and thinking, really? Well, you can see they did put a line of best fit here. It's the red line that goes through it, but they didn't really need to bother. And for those who know your stats, what you know here is that there's a 0.67 correlation. What that means is, if you're between the ages of 18 and 21, I can predict whether you attend college just by knowing your parents' income. That's all I need to know about you to predict with 2/3 accuracy. This is simultaneous, because this is based on anonymized IRS data. It's a massive data set. This is simultaneously one of the most elegant and depressing charts in recent social science. I'm deliberately leaving it for a moment because I want it to remain on the retina of every single person in this room when we think about the challenge that we face in this country, about the inheritance of inequality. Which colleges do then people go to? Again, this is Chetty data. Now I'm looking at the bottom 40 again and middle 40, next 20. Well, it depends which income group you come back from. If you're from the bottom 40, modal institution is community college, followed by non-selective 4 years, slightly selective 4 years, almost none to the elites. For the top 20%, the modal institute, the modal most likely place you go is to a selective higher education institution and a chunk to elites as well. So what the, I'm quoting Anthony Carnevale here, what the US college system does is take the inequality handed to it and amplify it. Horace Mann said that college was the great equalizer, the balance wheel of our social machinery. And so it is, as I think I just showed in earlier slides. But it's also the great stratifier, because access to and through, and that's why getting those from less advantaged backgrounds to and through college is the closest thing to a silver bullet that we have in the opportunity space. Closest thing we have. It's incredibly hard, but you can see what will happen if we don't. And by the way, the people who are working in these institutions, the modal institution for the bottom 80% of kids is community college. You wouldn't think that from our national debate about higher education, would you? And the people who are running our, in my view, very largely underfunded community colleges, open admission, torn between the pressure to become more like 4 years and provide more liberal arts, to become more vocational, under very strict scrutiny in terms of accountability, are, in my view, doing God's work and don't get the attention and recognition they deserve. So, now, what people will say in colleges, especially the better ones, will say, well, we want to take more poor kids, but they don't have the scores. This is SAT scores by income background, using College Board stats. So they'll say, well, look, it's not that we're deliberately discriminating against poor people. Look, it's just that we just take people with SAT scores up here. And amazingly, the majority of those people are from affluent families that have had the resources and the schooling to get them through it. But the institutions can tell themselves that they're acting meritocratically. We're a meritocracy. We just take the people with the highest scores. Well, then it replicates itself, because you've defined meritocracy in such a way as to suit your own purposes. And that's a profound challenge. And in fact, I'm going to probably end with this philosophy. Well, when do I need to stop, Paige? Give me a sort of sense of, like, should I shut up now? 2.5, 3 minutes. I can do it. I've just got to do some philosophy and some economics. 5, let's have a vote. America's a democracy, right? All right, hands up who can take 5 more minutes. Right, hands up who can take 10 more minutes. It's a lot for 10, but let's try and come in at 7. 7? Yeah, but Dan's like, get out of the way, they're here for the food. All right. Bernard Williams, who's a famous British philosopher, sadly lost to us now, had a thought experiment where he talked about a warrior society, a fighting society, where it was hereditary and basically, and the warriors got all the money and the glory, and it was sexist as well. The sons of warriors became warriors. And then there's a reform which says it shouldn't be hereditary. You should be the best person. The person who's the best fighter should do it. So then they have completely meritocratic tests. You don't even know where people's family are from. But it turns out that the sons of the fighters continue to become the fighters because they're well-trained and well-nourished, and they've been, from the moment they're born, ready for the test. And so what happens is there's no real change in the outcomes. And what happens is that the reformers say, we haven't got equality of opportunity. The wealthy say, yes, you have. You have the opportunity of becoming warriors. It's just bad luck. Their characteristics are such they don't pass the test. We are not excluding anybody for being poor. We're excluding people for being weak. And it is unfortunate that those who are poor are also weak. Now, that's an odd sort of society. But let's imagine it was a college test. You might say, we are not excluding anybody for being poor. We're excluding people for being dumb, or perhaps not college ready enough. It is just unfortunate that those who are poor are also dumb or not college ready enough. And so, what could be a good idea, meritocracy, is in fact a bad idea, which Michael Young knew when he coined the term 60 years ago as a warning. His book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, is a dystopia, not a utopia. So, this is one slide I'm glad I got to, because there is new work coming out of the Harvard Equality Opportunity Project within the next few weeks, which goes into even more geographical detail than this. This shows you upward mobility rates by commuting zone. But from the time that the next work comes out, you'll be able to do it by census tract. So for every census tract in Vermont, you'll be able to see what the long-range outcomes are economically, socially, and educationally for everybody by race, education, and gender. You're about to have data, merged IRS and census tract data, which is like nothing you've ever seen before. So we're a bit guilty, I think, of opportunity hoarding. And what do I mean by opportunity hoarding? I mean there are these very valuable, scarce goods that we're keeping to ourselves. And I'm going to give you 3 in my last 2 minutes. Exclusionary zoning. I don't know enough about your area to know whether this is a big issue, but it's a big issue in many places. What we do is we buy expensive houses near great schools and then zone out all the poor people so that they don't come in and ruin things. House prices go up. I then get subsidized by the federal government through the mortgage interest deduction, and it's a kind of perfect system. Land is becoming more and more of an issue in the US. Access to affordable housing. Housing is becoming, by every passing month, more of an issue. So that's a big issue. It's becoming expensive because we're regulating more. This is a chart showing you how many land use regulations there are. This is a chart showing you that Los Angeles used to be zoned for 10 million, now it's zoned for 4.3, which is exactly the number it contains, as local housing boards and zoning boards inevitably cater to the people who live in them. NIMBYs. So you need to become a YIMBY. Yes in my backyard, not no in my backyard if we're serious about opportunity. And then last, legacy of preferences in college admissions. I think I can do this pretty quickly. It's embarrassing, unfair, and time that it stopped. These are admissions rates to these elite institutions for legacy applicants versus general applicants. The US is the only country in the world that still does it. We got rid of it in the middle of the 20th century in the UK. Even our royal family can't get into Oxford and Cambridge. They don't get the grades. But here, weirdly, the idea of a hereditary principle in college admissions goes unquestioned, even by self-proclaimed liberals. It's not a partisan point. Lastly, internship opportunities. This is a survey of HR managers who recruit, particularly from college, as to what's most important to them, and internships came top now. They rank having done an internship as hugely important. Internships are more important labour market institutions than before. Half of them are unpaid, and many of them are allocated on the basis of who you know, through social networks, as favours, sometimes even to funders. I had one funder ask me if his daughter could get an internship at Brookings. And I said, you obviously haven't read my book. And I said, no. I also turned down one of Tony Blair's kids a long time ago for an internship, because the truth is that if those of us who are in positions to hand out these opportunities and to create them, so if you're an employer and you have internship opportunities, think very hard about who you're giving them to. If you're helping somebody out, that's the neighborly thing to do, but just think about how you're using not only your financial capital, but your social capital. This will require us to do the following. There was a progressive era in US politics, which I didn't know much about, so I've been reading a lot of Richard Hofstadter. And Richard Hofstadter said of the last progressive era, which I think we need in some ways to repeat, the following, that the moral indignation was by no means directed entirely against others. Now moral indignation is always directed against others. The 1%, immigrants, people of color, whoever. It's never us, is it? It's always directed against others. It was in great and critical measure directed inward. Contemporaries who spoke of the movement as an affair of the conscience were not mistaken. My belief is that to bring about the sort of progressive changes that we need to genuinely tackle the opportunity gap, we also need a new affair of the conscience. We need some self-criticism and some reflection. And if not you, here, now, who, where, and when? Thank you.
As I said, part of the role of philanthropy is to challenge us and inspire us. And thank you, Richard, for those remarks, which I think have both challenged and inspired us.